The letter showed up without warning, folded neatly, stamped officially, and carrying a number that made my stomach drop. $10,000. No explanation that made sense. No warning. Just a fine from the HOA, claiming I'd violated a rule I didn't even know existed. Overnight, I went from a quiet homeowner to a target, watched, documented, and pressured at every turn. What started as confusion quickly became intimidation, then outright punishment. And the more I tried to comply, the worse it got. They thought I would pay and stay quiet. They were wrong. What they didn't realize was that this fine would trigger a chain of events they'd spend years regretting. Before any of this happened, my life in the neighborhood was quiet in the most ordinary way. I bought the house for stability, not status. A modest place on a clean street, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and the promise of predictability. It was the kind of community marketed as peaceful and well-managed, where nothing unexpected ever happened and everyone followed the same invisible script. That was the appeal. After years of moving around, I wanted permanence. I wanted routine. I wanted to be left alone. Most days looked the same. Early mornings, steady work, evenings spent maintaining the house and enjoying the small sense of ownership that came with it. I wasn't trying to stand out. I didn't remodel anything flashy or push boundaries. I paid my dues on time, waved politely at neighbors, and assumed the HOA existed in the background, quietly handling landscaping contracts and pool maintenance. It felt distant, bureaucratic, almost irrelevant, at least at first. The neighborhood itself had a curated feel, like it had been designed to project harmony. Rules were posted, but rarely discussed. Everything had a standard: acceptable paint shades, lawn height, parking arrangements. None of it seemed unreasonable on the surface, and I never imagined those rules would apply to me in any meaningful way. I wasn't the kind of person who attracted attention. I blended in, and I liked it that way. Over time, though, I began noticing subtle things. The occasional inspection notice slipped into the mailbox, a reminder about compliance deadlines that felt oddly specific. Cars slowing down near my driveway more often than before. A sense that someone, somewhere, was paying closer attention than necessary. It was easy to dismiss at first. HOAs are paperwork heavy by nature, and I told myself I was reading too much into it. What I didn't know was that the neighborhood had its own internal hierarchy. Certain residents carried influence without holding obvious titles. Committees existed that never seemed to rotate. Decisions were made quietly, documented formally, and enforced selectively. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were tools, and like any tool, they could be used carefully or weaponized. There was also a growing tension beneath the surface of the community. Small disputes over property lines, complaints about noise that never quite matched reality, anonymous reports that seemed to appear whenever someone fell out of favor. None of it affected me directly, but it created an atmosphere of unease, like walking on a floor that looked solid but sounded hollow when you stepped on it. I still believed I was safe from all of that. I followed the rules as I understood them. I maintained my property. I stayed polite. I assumed that fairness was built into the system, that any issue could be resolved with common sense and communication. That assumption would turn out to be my biggest mistake. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. A notice that felt routine but carried an unfamiliar tone. Language that was unusually firm. References to sections and clauses I'd never seen before. It suggested a violation, but didn't clearly explain what I'd done. I expected clarification. I expected reason instead. What followed felt less like enforcement and more like escalation. That was when I began to understand that this wasn't about compliance. It wasn't about rules or order or community standards. It was about control, perception, and a power structure that didn't like being questioned. And without realizing it, I had stepped into the center of something that had been quietly building. Long before my name ever appeared on their paperwork at the time, I still believed it could be fixed. I still thought logic would win. I had no idea how fast things were about to spiral, or how a neighborhood built on the promise of calm would turn into the setting for one of the most exhausting battles of my life. The escalation didn't happen all at once. It arrives in layers, each one heavier than the last, each one harder to dismiss. After that first vague notice, more followed. Different envelopes, different dates, always official, always impersonal. Each one referenced a different rule, a different subsection, a different supposed violation. None of them explained how the problem started or why it suddenly mattered now. The message was consistent, though. I was no longer invisible at first. I assumed it was a clerical mistake, a misfiled complaint, a checkbox marked wrong during an inspection. I reviewed the HOA handbook line by line, expecting clarity. Instead, I found ambiguity, broad language, rules written so loosely they could mean almost anything if interpreted aggressively enough, maintenance standards that depended on subjective judgment, appearance guidelines that relied on community harmony rather than measurable criteria. It was unsettling, but I still believed logic would straighten it out. That belief didn't last. The next notice arrived with a deadline, then a penalty. A small fine at first, but paired with language that suggested it would grow. Daily administrative fees, enforcement costs. Suddenly a minor issue had teeth. I responded in writing, calmly, methodically, asking for clarification and evidence. Days passed, no response. The silence felt intentional, like waiting was part of the punishment. Then the inspections began. I didn't receive schedules. I didn't receive warnings. I only noticed the signs after the fact. Tire tracks near the curb that hadn't been there before. Footprints cutting across the edge of my lawn. Photos attached to emails, taken from angles that made ordinary details look suspicious. A fence shadow cast at the wrong time of day. A patch of grass that appeared slightly darker in one image than another. The scrutiny was relentless, and it was clear they were building a case. The fines increased. What had started as a manageable amount grew into something that demanded attention. Every new notice referenced the previous ones, stacking them like evidence in a trial I hadn't agreed to participate in. Requests for hearings were acknowledged but never scheduled. Appeals were logged but never resolved. The system was moving forward without me, and every step seemed designed to limit my ability to slow it down. Neighbors started behaving differently. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others watched a little too closely as I pulled into the driveway or stepped outside. Few offered sympathetic smiles that vanished the moment anyone else came into view. It didn't take long to realize that narratives were circulating, quiet but effective. I wasn't just a homeowner dealing with an HOA anymore. I was a problem. A cautionary example, the harassment took on smaller, pettier forms. Notices about trash bins being visible for too long, even when they were inside the required window. Complaints about noise on days I wasn't even home. Warnings about parking violations despite my car being in my own driveway. Each incident was minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I started documenting everything: photos, dates, times, copies of every notice, screenshots of messages. I treated my own home like a crime scene, afraid that any detail I overlooked would be used against me later. The sense of safety I once felt evaporated. The house didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt monitored, measured, judged. Then came the number that changed everything. The notice didn't soften the blow. It didn't offer options. It simply stated the total amount owed due to continued non-compliance. $10,000. Accumulated through fines, penalties, administrative fees, and enforcement costs. It framed the sum as inevitable, the natural, a result of my failure to cooperate. The implication was clear: pay now, or face consequences that would be far worse. That was the moment confusion turned into anger. I reviewed every accusation again, this time with a different mindset. I wasn't looking for compliance anymore. I was looking for justification. Evidence, anything that explained how routine maintenance issues could spiral into a 5-figure demand. What I found instead were inconsistencies, dates that didn't line up, violations cited before inspections supposedly occurred, rules enforced against me that were ignored elsewhere in the neighborhood. I began walking the community with new AIs. Other homes had the same features I was being fined for. Similar landscaping, similar exterior details. The difference was not compliance, it was attention. I had been singled out. Whether it was personal, political, or simply convenient, I didn't know, but the realization shifted something in me. This wasn't about fixing a problem, it was about asserting dominance. The HOA escalated again. A lean thread appeared in the next notice. Language about collections. Mentions of legal action. The tone shifted from administrative to aggressive, as if the paperwork itself had grown impassioned. I was given a short window to respond, even shorter than before. The pressure was deliberate. The goal wasn't resolution, it was submission. Sleep became difficult. Every sound outside felt like surveillance. Every letter in the mailbox carried weight. The stress followed me into work, into conversations, into moments that used to feel neutral. I found myself replaying events, searching for the exact moment I crossed an invisible line. The harder I looked, the more obvious it became that there wasn't one. I requested a formal hearing again, this time with documentation attached. The response came quickly but offered nothing concrete. The hearing would be scheduled at a later date. No timeline, no assurance, just another pause that allowed fines to continue accumulating. It felt like being trapped on a conveyor belt that only moved in one direction. That was when I noticed something else. The board members involved in my case were the same ones who seemed untouchable in the community, long-standing positions, familiar names, people whose properties never seemed to attract scrutiny no matter how closely they resembled the supposed violations listed in my file. The power imbalance was no longer theoretical, it was visible, structural, and intentional. The next escalation came without warning. A notice appeared citing failure to cooperate, referencing my appeals as evidence of obstruction rather than engagement. The fines increased again. The total climbed higher, inching toward a point that felt surreal. The idea that an HOA could impose this kind of financial pressure over ambiguous rules felt absurd. Yet it was happening in real time. I considered giving in. Paying the fine would hurt, but fighting it felt exhausting. That was the calculation. They were counting on. Wear me down. Isolate me. Make resistance more painful than compliance. For a moment, it almost worked. The thought of ending the stress, even at a steep cost, was tempting. But then something unexpected happened. A neighbor slipped a note into my mailbox. No name, no explanation, just a brief message acknowledging what was happening and hinting that I wasn't the first. It mentioned others who had challenged the HOA and quietly disappeared from meetings, committees, conversations. It suggested a pattern that extended far beyond my situation. That changed everything. I wasn't dealing with an isolated dispute. I was standing in the middle of a system that punished resistance and rewarded silence. The fines weren't just penalties. They were warnings. And if I backed down now, the message would be clear. The HOA scheduled the hearing at last. The notice arrived with minimal details and maximum pressure, a date, a time, a reminder that fines would continue to accrue until the matter was resolved. It framed the hearing as an opportunity, but the language made it clear they expected only one outcome: compliance, payment, closure on their terms. As the date approached, the scrutiny intensified. Another inspection, another notice, another added fee. It felt like they were stacking the deck, ensuring that even if I made progress, the damage would already be done. The total owed loomed over everything, a constant reminder of what was at stake. I prepared anyway. I organized documents, timelines, photographs. I traced the escalation from the first vague notice to the current threat of legal action. I highlighted inconsistencies and selective enforcement. I didn't know if it would matter, but I needed to be ready. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming agency in a situation designed to strip it away. The night before the hearing, I walked through the neighborhood one last time. The houses looked the same as they always had. Neat, predictable, calm. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But beneath that calm was a structure built on quiet compliance and unchallenged authority. I realized then that whatever happened next, things would never go back to the way they were, because the hearing wasn't the end. It was just the point where the conflict stopped being private and started becoming something the HOA couldn't control anymore. The day of the hearing arrived with a strange, unnatural calm. No warnings, no new notices, just silence, as if the HOA had already decided the outcome and didn't feel the need to pretend otherwise. I walked into that meeting carrying the full weight of months of pressure, paperwork, and quiet intimidation, fully aware that this was the moment everything would either collapse or finally break open. The room itself was unremarkable. New walls, folding tables, fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched, the kind of space designed to feel procedural, not personal. And yet, the tension was unmistakable. The board members sat with practiced confidence, their expressions carefully neutral, their posture signaling authority rather than openness. This wasn't framed as a discussion. It was framed as a formality. It began by summarizing my history of non-compliance, laying out the fines as if they were facts rather than conclusions. Dates were listed. Amounts were tallied. The total loomed over the room, heavy and deliberate. $10,000, presented as the natural consequence of my own behavior. The implication was clear. This was my fault and this was the end of the road. But this time, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't asking for clarification or mercy. I had already reached the limit of what pressure could do. To me, what remained was resolve. I submitted my documentation. Not a single page, not a single complaint, but a full timeline. Every notice, every inspection, every fine arranged in order. Photos that showed the same alleged violations appearing across multiple properties without enforcement. Records that revealed fines issued before inspections supposedly took place. Communications that went unanswered for weeks, then cited as failures to respond. Patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The atmosphere shifted. What had felt routine became uncomfortable. The board members scanned the material more closely now, their certainty giving way to calculation. The process slowed. The confidence that had carried them through months of escalation began to falter, not dramatically, but noticeably. The story they had been telling no longer flowed as smoothly. Then came the turning point. Buried within the documents was a detail they hadn't anticipated, being challenged, a procedural requirement embedded in their own bylaws. A rule about enforcement timelines and notice obligations that had been ignored repeatedly in my case. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't subjective. It was specific, measurable, and documented, in black and white. And their own records proved they had violated it. That single detail unraveled everything if the procedure hadn't been followed. The fines weren't just excessive. They were invalid. The enforcement actions weren't just aggressive. They were unauthorized. And the lean threats weren't just intimidation. They were exposure. The room grew tense in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with authority or formality. This was no longer about compliance, it was about liability. About what happened if this didn't end quietly. About what happened if someone outside that room started asking questions. The board shifted strategies. Suddenly the tone softened, language changed. What had been framed as final became open to review. What had been non-negotiable became subject to adjustment. The very rules that had been wielded so aggressively were now treated as flexible guidelines rather than absolute standards. The pivot was obvious, and it was telling. But the most shocking moment hadn't happened yet. As the review continued, it became clear that my case wasn't isolated. Inconsistencies in enforcement weren't limited to my property. They appeared in patterns, selective application, targeted scrutiny, a structure that relied on ambiguity to maintain control. The more the board tried to defend its actions, the more exposed the system became. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about a process that depended on homeowners not pushing back, on fear outweighing curiosity, on pressure replacing fairness. And in that room, under the weight of their own documentation, that process began to crack. The final blow came not from anger but from clarity. When the board attempted to justify the fines as discretionary, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Discretion had been exercised only in one direction. Enforcement had escalated without transparency. Appeals had been stalled without explanation. And the financial penalties had grown to a level that bore no reasonable connection to the alleged violations. The power imbalance they relied on had become their weaknesses by the end of the hearing. The narrative had completely reversed. What was supposed to be a reckoning for me had become an examination of them. The fines were no longer presented as a debt owed, but as a problem to be contained. The authority they had projected for months now felt brittle, defensive, reactive. And then, without ceremony, the decision shifted. The fines were suspended pending further review. Enforcement actions were paused. The lien threat was withdrawn. What had been inevitable just hours earlier was suddenly uncertain. The certainty that had fueled the HOA's campaign evaporated in real time. But the real impact wasn't procedural. It was psychological. For the first time since this began, I wasn't the one being watched. I wasn't the one under scrutiny. The balance had flipped, and everyone in that room knew it. The system that had operated quietly and confidently now faced the possibility of exposure. Not just to me, but to anyone who cared to look closely. As the meeting ended, there was no sense of victory, no dramatic declaration. Just a heavy silence and the unmistakable feeling that something fundamental had changed. The HOA hadn't admitted wrongdoing, they hadn't apologized, but they had and that retreat spoke louder than any words ever could. Walking out of that room, I understood that this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the moment the HOA realized they had pushed too far, and the moment I realized they were no longer in control of what happened next. What followed the hearing didn't arrive with fireworks or instant justice. It arrived slowly, deliberately, in the way real consequences often do. The HOA didn't announce a reversal. There was no dramatic apology, no admission of fault. Instead, there was a pause longer than any pause before it. Weeks passed without new notices, no inspections, no warnings taped to doors or tucked into mailboxes. The silence itself was the first confirmation that the balance of power had shifted. Eventually, a letter arrived. It was shorter than the others, carefully worded, neutral, to the point of being sterile. The fines were officially rescinded, not reduced, not negotiated, voided. The total balance was set to zero, effective immediately. The lien language was gone entirely, as if it had never existed. There was no explanation for how such a massive error had occurred, only a brief reference to procedural review and internal assessment. $10,000 vanished from my life in a single paragraph. The relief wasn't instant. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, heavy, and disorienting, like setting down a weight you'd been carrying for so long that your body had adjusted to the strain. For months, stress had dictated my routines, my sleep, my sense of safety. Letting go of that took time. Even after the fines were gone, the vigilance lingered, but the impact didn't stop with me. The HOA changed after that, though not in the way organizations like to advertise. There were no public statements about reform or transparency. Instead, the changes were subtle and unmistakable. Enforcement notices across the neighborhood dropped sharply. Inspections became scheduled and documented. Appeals were answered more promptly, with clearer explanations. The rules didn't disappear, but the aggression behind them did. Board meetings started to look different, attendance increased. Homeowners who had once stayed silent began showing up, sitting in the back, listening more closely. Questions were asked that hadn't been asked before. Requests for clarification. Requests for documentation. Requests for consistency. The quiet authority the HOA once wielded no longer went unchallenged, and that alone altered the dynamic. Some of the long-standing board members stepped down within the year. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, it felt like retreat. New faces appeared, less entrenched, more cautious. Committees were restructured, enforcement policies were rewritten in ways that emphasized process over discretion. The system didn't become perfect, but it became visible, and visibility was the one thing it had never relied on before. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began stopping to talk. At first it was tentative, casual comments about how intense things had been, quiet acknowledgments of relief. Then, more candid admissions surfaced. Others had been fined unfairly. Others had been pressured into compliance over questionable violations. Some had paid simply to make it stop. My case hadn't been an exception. It had been the most visible example of a pattern that had existed for years. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't a story about winning against an HOA. It was a story about what happens when systems built on silence encounter resistance. The fines hadn't been about my property. They had been about precedent, about reminding everyone else what happened when someone didn't fall in line, and that reminder had failed. The personal aftermath took longer to resolve for a while. Every envelope still triggered a spike of anxiety. Every unfamiliar car slowed near my driveway drew my attention. The sense of being watched doesn't disappear overnight, especially when it's been reinforced for months. But gradually, the house felt like mine again. The neighborhood regained its shape as a place to live, not a battleground to navigate. I stopped documenting every detail, stopped checking the handbook compulsively, stopped expecting conflict at every turn. Normalcy returned not as an announcement, but as a series of small, unremarkable days, and that was the most satisfying outcome of all. The experience changed how I see authority. Before all this, I believed that systems were inherently reasonable, that rules existed to maintain fairness, and that escalation was always the result of misunderstanding. What I learned instead was that power, when unchecked, doesn't need malice to cause harm. It only needs indifference, ambiguity, a structure that discourages questions and rewards compliance. HOAs, like many governing bodies, rely on the assumption that most people won't push back. Not because they're wrong, but because pushing back is exhausting, time-consuming, emotionally draining. The cost of resistance is designed to feel higher than the cost of submission. That calculus only works until someone refuses to accept it. I didn't win because I was louder or angrier, or more aggressive. I won because I paid attention. I documented. I learned the rules as they were written, not as they were enforced. I stayed persistent when the process tried to wear me down. And most importantly, I didn't let fear dictate my decisions when the pressure peaked. That distinction matters. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The HOA didn't regret fining me because I embarrassed them or outmaneuvered them publicly. They regretted it because the tactic they relied on failed. The moment it failed, it became a liability not just in my case, but in every case that followed. The long-term impact extended beyond the neighborhood. Now approach contracts differently. Agreements, fine print, any system that asks for trust without transparency. I ask questions earlier. I document sooner. I assume nothing about fairness without verification. It's not cynicism, it's clarity. And it's a clarity that cost me months of stress to earn. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's this: quiet compliance is the fuel that keeps abusive systems running. They don't collapse under outrage. They collapse under scrutiny. The HOA expected me to pay and disappear. They expected exhaustion to do their work for them. What they didn't expect was that pushing too far would force someone to look closely enough to expose the cracks holding everything together. And once those cracks are visible, they never fully close again. So if you ever find yourself staring at a letter that doesn't make sense, carrying a number that feels designed to scare you into silence, ask yourself one question before you give in. Is this really about a rule, or is it about seeing how much pressure you'll tolerate before you stop fighting back?